One of the good things about working with WTM on this programme is that they don't insist that every topic we put on will pull a capacity audience. We have wildlife in here tomorrow morning, and it'll probably be standing room only. But we will continue to do issues like child protection and human rights in an effort to get the industry to engage with these issues. But it is a bit of an uphill battle. So I'm particularly grateful to you all for coming. I hope you were all scanned on the way in. Please, if you weren't, please get yourself scanned as you leave, because that's how they do the numbers. But it is a very important topic that we've got. We've got a limited amount of time to do it, and 5 really good speakers, so I'm keen to get started. I'm going to start with Matthias, he's CSR advisor for Kuoni, but he's speaking as a member of the Roundtable on Human Rights in Tourism. So Matthias, if you'd like to come and take the podium. And your clicker is right there.
Yep, thank you. Good evening. So thank you, Harold, for inviting me and presenting on the corporate responsibility to respect the human rights. And Harold asked me to tell you a little bit more about the scope and how we did the work at Kuoni, and also how the Roundtable on Human Rights and Business is operating in various European countries. So when we talk about human rights in the travel and tourism sectors, it's not a new issue. We talked about land rights, child protection, water scarcity, exploitation of children. So there are many different topics actually that a lot of tour operators in the travel and tourism sector have been working already for quite a while. So human rights are not new. And the tourism sector is in my perspective, is one of the sectors that has actually many actual or potential risks related to human rights. Those risks can be in the supply chain, and we all know and we are aware that the tourism supply chain actually is very complex. It can be a supplier of a supplier, a laundry in a hotel in Phuket, or a small inbound operator in Dubai. So when we talk about human rights, actually, we not only look into it from a risk perspective on the business, but even more on the impacts on the potential rights holders. So it's a very complex issue, especially when we look into the supply chain. We can have impacts through our products and services, products we sell, destination we sell, so there are many potential and actual impacts, especially when we do business in post-conflict areas. Most recently, there have been discussion about doing business in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, destinations where actually the government is not fulfilling the duty to protect the human rights. There is even more responsibility for the businesses to support human rights related issues. So there are many issues related to human rights impacts and travel and tourism. And I just want to highlight one example. We have been doing quite some work at that time at Kuoni when we talk about the right to water. We all know that actually water is a scarce resource. Access to fresh water is an issue in many of the destinations. We heard this year actually in Mallorca that water is getting scarce for the local population. There was some water saving measures for the communities, but also for tourists. So access to water is a very difficult issue. We talk about pollution of drinking water at tourism destination, and at the end, whole communities can be cut off actually from their access to clean water. And this is infringing on the human right to water and a part of the right to adequate standard of living. So we can see a lot of potential and actual impacts. So when we talk about these issues, I think it's always important, what can you do as a business? And there are various things you can do. You can start working in your own operation, saving water in a hotel. You can make sure that actually communities get access to clean water, and work with NGOs and other stakeholders along the communities to ensure the guarantee and access to drinking water. In 2011, a special rapporteur for the UN, he has published the so-called UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights. And those UN Guiding Principles, they provide an internationally agreed framework. And the 3 pillars actually outline pretty clear what the corporate responsibility to respect human rights is. Foremost, there is certainly the first pillar, which says, in terms of human rights, it's the state duty to protect human rights. So first of all, the government, the states, they have the duty to protect human rights. But there is also a clear corporate responsibility that requires businesses to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through companies' own activities. I think it's very clear, very concrete, and the third pillar says that everybody should have access to a remedy. So companies should avoid causing and contributing to adverse human rights impact, and also prevent and implement mitigating measures when it comes to human rights impact in the source countries, but also at the destination level. So those UN Guiding Principles are actually pretty clear, pretty straightforward, and outline in a process which is called human rights due diligence what a company should do. And this follows actually an ongoing process. This includes stakeholder engagement, partnerships and dialogue. At Kuoni, we worked a lot with UNICEF. We might hear afterwards about the work UNICEF did. We consulted with NGOs such as Amnesty International, smaller German organizations such as Brot für die Welt. And we learned a lot in this dialogue in terms of defining a policy, seeing where the potential and actual issues are. And then conducting risk assessments, impact assessment. I think this is the work that every company actually has to do. And I think the word due diligence says it has to be decided within a company whatever kind of measures you can take and want to take, but there's not negotiable that you cannot do anything. And what is really important when you talk about human rights, there are a lot of issues that you cannot solve alone as a single company. It needs this multi-stakeholder setup. And that's actually when the Roundtable on Human Rights in Tourism comes into place. A small group of tour operators and NGOs founded this multi-stakeholder initiative based on the UN Guiding Principles, because actually we learned that from the work we did in the past, that the dialogue with NGOs, with academics, and the tour operating businesses is very important, and you can learn actually a lot from each other. So the objective of the Roundtable on Human Rights is basically to promote human rights due diligence amongst tourism businesses by providing information, material, training tools, and so on. So there has been very clear guidance publication on how to implement human rights due diligence. There was a standard or a kind of a publication and recommendation for driver personnel has been published as a follow-up of the work we did in India. So you can see very concrete material that also the Roundtable on Human Rights in Tourism has been publishing, which shall support the businesses to implement human rights due diligence in the business. There is a huge diversity of different members. You can see small operators. We have certification schemes such as Travel Life. We have association, the Dutch association, the German Tour Operator Association, NGOs, scientific organizations. And I think it's a very good initiative to move forward this dialogue and make sure that human rights due diligence is part of the agenda in the travel and tourism sector. So everybody basically is free to join. There's also a representative from the Roundtable here today, which can certainly give you some further information. We want to have more members, not only in the majority of the German-speaking Europe, but certainly also here in the UK, in the Scandinavian market. So we want to expand on in the membership. So for me, what are the key messages when we talk about human rights? I think one is that we should think about impacts and not only risks. It's really thinking about what are the impacts on the rights holders. It's not only thinking in terms of business risks. And human rights impacts cannot be offset. It's not kind of a carbon offsetting scheme. You can build a school and then you fine out. So it cannot be offset. It is an ongoing activity. It's nothing that you can do once and then you can stop. It's really something that should be integrated into the business processes. You have to work with the supply chain management, with the product team, with the internal audit if you have such a team. So it's really about integrating human rights due diligence in the business. It is not a passive responsibility. It really demands meaningful engagement. So you have to make sure that you engage with the communities, with the stakeholders, in order to have an impact at the end. Yeah, and I think it's really important to see that everybody is responsible to do something apart from the size. It means something for the big operators, for the certification scheme. An association has a certain responsibility, but also small operators in the source market, but also in the destinations. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Matthias. We're going to look next at child rights. So one of the interesting things, just while you come and join us, about today is people ask me what's happened to the child protection session. In a way, that's a legitimate question. We've run one for the last 4 years. But what I wanted to do this year was to put the question of child's rights in the context of human rights. Because the last time I checked, children were human beings as well. So if you'd like to talk about UNICEF's work on child protection, but in the human rights context.
Yep. Thank you very much, Harold. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Sama Abbasi. I'm a senior policy and advocacy advisor at UNICEF UK, looking specifically at the private sector. And for the last 2 years, my work has predominantly focused on tourism and its impact on children. We're thrilled this year that that human rights are so visible on the agenda, and that we're looking beyond child protection as an issue. Now, clearly, tourism has a huge potential to positively impact children's rights. That's evident across a number of sessions that we've seen today. The very fact that sustainable tourism is referenced in 3 separate SDGs points to the recognition of the industry as a catalyst for development. But really, to truly realise the potential, what we need to see is a concerted effort by companies to really understand how their business operations and their supply chains have an impact on children's lives, both positive and negative, and using the framework that Matthias referred to, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's not to say that we haven't seen significant action by the industry on specific issues. As Harold mentioned, child protection is probably the issue related to children that's received the most attention over the last decade or so when we look at how the industry has interacted with children's rights. But the impacts faced by children extend, way beyond child protection, and it's that broader range of impacts that I'll be talking about today. It is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm conscious of time, and it's the end of the day, and there are a couple of issues that will be covered by other speakers as well, so I'll try to make this brief. So one of the things that I think people tend to be quite surprised is when we talk about impacts on children, we're not just talking about direct impacts, we're talking about indirect impacts too. We all know from being children ourselves that our happiness and our well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of our parents. So working conditions are really, really important when we're talking about children's rights. Tourism is a fantastic job creator. We know that. It provides jobs that require little to no formal training for many, many people, often vulnerable groups like women, migrant workers, young people. But in many countries, average wages in tourism are often lower than the economy as a whole. Salaries in tourism might meet the minimum requirement, the national minimum wage in many countries. It might even exceed that, but it rarely constitutes a living wage. What that means in practice is that employees don't have enough to cover their own basic needs, let alone those of their families. For children, the impacts can be significant. In some cases, it might mean missing out on an education. It might mean missing out on medical treatment, not getting nutritious food. And in some cases, it leads to children looking for ways to supplement their family income. So the consequences of low wages can have a very significant impact on children's rights. We see pretty widespread use of temporary contracts in tourism. Obviously, it's a sort of standard way of dealing with the industry's highs and lows. But it can leave workers financially insecure. And in some cases, workers on a temporary contract aren't able to access the same state benefits as permanent employees. Again, that has an impact on children's right to an adequate standard of living if their parents don't have that financial stability. This is a sector that's characterised by long hours, often unsociable hours, schedules that can rotate on a weekly or a monthly basis, and split shifts. All of those can have a significant impact on family life, both in terms of parents having the ability to actually rest and the quality of time that children get to spend with their parents. Childcare continues to be a challenge for working parents, especially if they're on low wages. Children whose parents do work long and irregular hours and can't afford to access childcare may be left to travel home from school by themselves. They may have to look after younger siblings. That situation where they're left unsupervised exposes them to multiple risks. They're at greater risk of being neglected, of abuse, and of injury. Now, obviously, this is in the context of them living in sometimes very busy tourist destinations, so risks can be heightened. You know, we're looking at environments that may have high levels of alcohol consumption, a big influx of strangers, higher levels of noise, usually the acceptance of prostitution. So children living in these environments are at greater risk. And often what we find is in very popular tourist destinations where tourism is the main industry, both parents work in the industry. So if they've got rotating schedules that don't match up, you can have days where kids don't spend time with both parents, and that's quite common. I just wanted to quickly talk about particular support for working mothers, just because they women make up the majority of the tourism workforce, but we still see them concentrated in the lowest paid, lowest status jobs, often with inadequate maternity protections. Of course, not all of this is the responsibility of companies to provide. As Matthias mentioned, there's a huge emphasis on government's duty to protect human rights, but there are more things that companies can be doing to support working mothers. We've heard across a number of destinations that new mothers find it very difficult to breastfeed because of the operational demands of a tourism business. Companies could offer, breaks, places to breastfeed their children, and really, it's difficult to think of a business better suited to providing room for its employees to breastfeed than for a hotel, for example. And finally, flexible working options. It's still flexible working for tourism employees is still quite a rarity, and that places additional stress on working mums. In most countries, the burden of childcare conventionally rests on women, so that's another stress on working mums. Looking beyond the workplace, child labour is a risk for multiple industries, not just tourism, but the ILO estimates that there are between 13 to 19 million children working in an occupation tied to tourism. Obviously, that can, undermines children's safety. It has an impact on their rights to education and health. Children can be found working in a number of different jobs, from selling goods on beaches, and we've probably all seen that when we visited destinations, selling sort of low-value trinkets and souvenirs, carrying luggage, working in restaurants as waiters or porters in hotels. But they're also found in the supply chain of hotels and restaurants and other tourism businesses. And often the highest risk of child labour is in those supply chains that extend into the informal economy, so the places that are hidden, things like construction sites and farms. So, if you look at the sort of fresh produce that hotel restaurants may be purchasing, there may be high risk of child labour in those supply chains. And another area where we see that children are impacted by tourism activity, okay, I'm going to speed up, is to do with land, water, and environment. I'll skip over water because Matthias has already mentioned that. But when land is acquired and used by developers to construct new tourism ventures, children often risk losing their homes, their inheritance. It can affect how they access school, health services, the areas that they're used to playing in. Even though their needs are very important, they're often overlooked. So when consultations happen with community representatives, it's usually the adult males that are consulted. And women, young people, children are often neglected in those processes, so their needs are often overlooked. An additional level of vulnerability comes into play when we're talking about Indigenous children, because there are many concerns in multiple destinations that tourism development projects are undertaken on Indigenous lands without prior consent of affected communities. Just a quick note, on environmental impacts, children are more vulnerable to negative environmental impacts than adults. But again, their needs are often overlooked. And on the last slide, I was really glad actually to see that many of the things that I wanted to conclude on marry with what Matthias was saying. What do we think businesses can do? Undertake human rights due diligence. It's the starting point. It must be informed by the UN Guiding Principles, and we worked with Save the Children and the UN Global Compact to develop the Children's Rights and Business Principles, which basically just offers a child rights lens to the Guiding Principles. We've been working with a number of different companies across a number of different regions, so Latin America and Vietnam, looking at how the sector has an impact on children's lives, and hopefully we'll be publishing the findings of those various research projects early next year, so do look out for that. That due diligence has to be underpinned by consultation with affected rights holders. No amount of desk-based research or talking to experts is a substitute for talking to people who are actually affected by business operations. It can really give you a much better picture of problems that are so often hidden in plain sight. A couple of final points. We'd say focus on efforts to reduce negative impacts. Here, the UN Guiding Principles are very, very clear. It's the point about offsetting. Doing good in one part of your business, doesn't offset bad stuff that you're doing in another part of your business. So your focus has to be on addressing the negative impacts first. Of course, we'd encourage businesses to do more to scale up those activities that have a great positive impact. Things like focusing on youth employment in areas where unemployment rates for young people are high, great. Collaborative advocacy, another really underused tool, I think, by this industry, especially when we look at how the retail industry have come together to advocate on things like minimum wage rises in countries like Cambodia. Think about the power of tourism, the tourism industry in destinations, and the kind of leverage that their collective voice could have to address some of the issues that I've been talking about. And just finally, the UN Guiding Principles really should be the entry point for addressing things like these SDGs. We had a session on that earlier on, and we would say, undertake human rights due diligence, get a good picture of where you have most impact, focus your efforts on those, and that will give you a roadmap for where you contribute to the SDGs. Otherwise, you risk taking a scattergun approach and not having the focus that you need or having the most impact. That's it.
Thanks very much. We're going to stick with the issues of child protection, because Philip is going to come and talk about issues of child protection in volunteering, I think, amongst other things, no doubt. But come and talk about it, Philip. So let's just note this: two of the 5 have been talking about child protection.
Thanks very much, everyone. My name is Philip Mirjana. I'm from an organisation in Ireland called COLOV, easy to say and easy to read. We're a member supporter organisation, but we also provide services to the international development sector based on core values of solidarity, sustainability and justice. We do a lot of work on human rights, a lot of work on volunteering standards. I'm in a long way out of my comfort zone here, even meeting this many people in the same place at the same time. If I had this many people at any of my events back in Dublin, I'd be jumping through the roof. So I'm coming from a different place from the rest of you that are used to big events like this. So I'm going back to, I suppose, basics in terms of what I see as the issues around human rights. So they're everywhere. I'm old enough to remember these guys when they were new, The Clash, and they told us to know our rights in '79, all three of them. You have the right not to be killed, to food money, and to free speech. But if I was a little bit younger, I could go back and reference Beyonce or the Kardashians or Kanye West or anyone else, because even if you're a parent and you're trying to get your kids to eat their dinner before they watch the TV or do their homework, they'll tell you that they have rights. So I'm saying, first of all, that human rights are ubiquitous. They're absolutely everywhere. And certainly in the culture that I live in, people are talking about them all the time, even down to when I was 7 in primary school, sneaking out to buy a 7-inch of The Clash. The second thing about rights, and sorry for being very flippant around the type of things that you take seriously, but there they are universal. They are for everyone. So there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's the Declaration on the Rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Universal Declaration says they are for everyone. The Children's Rights Convention says some people need extra care taken with their rights. Oh, missed that one. And there's some examples that I'm not going to go into now because I don't want to get a red card, Harold, around exactly where the Universal Declaration, which particular parts of the convention come back to that kind of a thing. SDGs say leave no one behind. And they then go on to say that make special effort to support the rights of those people that need extra support. And that's as current as you can get. That's more current than the 1970s punk rock. For the day that's in it, go across the ocean, go and talk to Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump, and they will tell you that they believe passionately and fervently that we believe these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and therefore all are endowed with certain inalienable rights. They're universal. That's 2 points out of 4 that I'm going to make. In terms of what it means to be a consumer, there's something from The Guardian from 100 years ago around what ethical consumerism means. But I'm saying it's easier or more complicated than that. All you need to do is to live those rights and expect them to be applied universally. And as an example, there's TripAdvisor saying they're not going to sell tickets to wildlife attractions anymore. It works. When the consumer says, I don't want that kind of a thing, the tourism industry can respond like that because it's a real now thing. You know, I was boycotting Nestle milk when I was 18 and in college, and that's still going on, and it was going on a long time before that, and it's a long drudgery of campaign. But for the travel industry, people want something now. You can provide it now, and that will impact on their experience and on your business. So they're commercially relevant. That's 3 out of 4. What does this mean? It means that all people have the same rights. People in destination countries have the same rights as I do, the same rights as you do when you're selling your product. Rights are balanced with responsibilities. My rights can take away yours. I think you said it so much better in terms of offsetting, but I'm down into three chords and the truth and that kind of a stuff. The rights of children and other vulnerable people absolutely have to be protected by the powerful. And that was the thing. The right to parents, the right to privacy, the right to protection from abuse and neglect, the right to health and health services. But it's not realistic or feasible for inexperienced non-experts, punters, coming in through the door or the virtual door to buy your product to know what that means. So they have to know whether they can trust you, and they have to know that if they trust you, when you say this is a rights-based or a respectful or an ethical or a sustainable or a responsible product, they have to know that they can trust you, that you're not just bluffing. What does it mean for travellers? They should expect and demand the same level of safeguarding and control when they're there as when they would at home. And that's back to that universality again. So if I don't want people to be working for less than the minimum wage, which is £9.15 in Ireland, because that's some attempt at a reasonable, sustainable amount of money for which people can live on, I expect a similar commitment to a sustainable income in my destination. Likewise, civil rights. Likewise, child rights and safeguarding and environmental. And there's obvious stuff there. You know, we don't have orphanages in Ireland anymore. And we were the last of the latest adopters of getting rid of orphanages in Ireland because we know they don't work. And yet still, Irish people will go out and post all over Facebook and Twitter about how great the work is that they're doing in orphanages when they're out there wherever there is. And it's simple. If you don't do it here, don't do it there. And likewise with animal petting. You know, you don't drug up your puppy before you take it to see your granny. So why would you drug up a tiger before you give it a thing? Just because you can get onto Twitter. That's not acceptable. Impact on the environment and oppressive regimes. But again, simple message. If you don't do it there, you shouldn't be doing it. If you don't do it here, you shouldn't be doing it there. The same slide then for you people, for businesses. Consumers know they want ethical, responsible products, but they don't know what they are, so that responsibility comes back to you. It is commercially viable because people do want it. Don't do the obvious stuff like providing orphanage trips or drugged up tigers. You need to be responsible and accountable, and you need a structure or a system so that that trust can be built. Point 4, they're deliverable. That is all I have to say on the matter. Thank you very much for listening. And you can find me on Twitter because I'm like Tigger, I'm the only one. Philip Mudge is my name. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip. Adma, you need to come and speak from here because you need a microphone.
For me?
Adma Barr. Okay. Mr. Barr, sorry, I should have called you Mr. Barr. I asked Mr. Barr to come onto the panel, actually in conversation with Matthias, which is, we couldn't quite do this without having somebody speaking from a community perspective about the rights of people. But can we keep it to 6 minutes?
Yes, we can. And that's why I'm not using the thing over there, because it takes more time. But anyway, I'm coming to tell you a story. And in Africa, if you are my age, you start telling stories. I will, of course, not treat you to the fire. Imagine you're in a village somewhere, you know, around the campfire, and I'm telling you a story. It could be a depressing story, but I want it a bit lighter. We were trained, we were told stories, when we were young, and through that we were being taught ethics on how to live a better life, how to be compassionate, how to respect others. So I would talk to you about respect. And there is nothing more disrespectful than actually engaging a community, going into a community, and not actually asking them whether what you will be doing is of interest to them, or even talking to the elders about your plans. Normally, what we have is some elders within a village. And when you come to engage a community, you actually go to the elders and talk to them about your plan. And these elders will communicate to the rest of the villagers about what this plan is. I want to talk to you about a small village some of you may have known called Jufure. Anke is smiling. She's been there before. Many been there. In the 70s, an African-American called Alex Haley, you must have heard about Kunta Kinte, said he actually traced his ancestors to come from this particular village in the Gambia called Jufure. And this was a big story. It also brought about an epic movie called Roots and a bestseller book called Roots. And many people saw this film, so many people crave to actually go and visit this small village in the Gambia called Jufure. At a certain time, 25% of tourists that visit the Gambia will go and visit this village called Jufure. Nobody asked the villagers whether they wanted to have tourists coming to visit their village. Nobody talked to them. The tour operators, the ground operators, ground handlers saw it as a business opportunity to go in and make money, of course. And then an excursion was drawn that will take tourists from the capital on a river cruise, 3 hours, to this small village called Jufure. And when they arrive, they get down on the jetty, walk through the village, visit a museum, visit the alcalde, who is the head of the village, and then visit the Kinte family. This is the family that Alex Haley said his ancestors are from this particular family. You remember there was this boy who was a slave, and then it's called Kunta Kinte. This is the Kinte family. Those are the descendants of Kunta Kinte. So a lot of people decided that they want to come and see the Kinte family and look at this whole history. Opposite this village on the river, you have a fort called James Island, where actually slaves were kept before. Now, when tourists come, they go directly visit, as I said, the alcalde, and then go to the Kinte family, and then visit a school and visit the museum. When they go to the alcalde, there is a donation box. And every tourist is encouraged to put in money into this donation box for the benefit of the community. Now, that happened for many years, many, many years. In fact, the people who I am dealing with in that village now, who I know, are now elders. They've got families. So after that, the tourists, 3 hours in the village, and then the tourists will go back to the jetty, go and visit James Island, and then go back to the capital. That's the trip. Now, you imagine such an interaction. Now, what that created was a community that actually started to become very dependent on tourists that come to the village. Kids will skip school because the tourist boat is coming and wait. In fact, teachers will encourage their kids to go out of the school so that when the tourists are passing by, they can actually drop something. They also have a donation box, and who knows, possibly the teacher will take everything from the kids. But this happened many years. In the same way, elders will actually, some of them will wait near the Kinte family. Women will wait to have that opportunity of having a photo with their children. And once the tourist takes a photo with the kid, with the child, then they will demand for about £1 or £2 from this tourist. It went to a level where even those women without children will go into another house and get a child and wait for the tourist to pass. And some of the women who may not be there on that day will actually give a child to a villager to say, go and wait when the tourists come. You may actually get your luck by getting $50 each from this tourist. And this became so serious that it actually turned up to be a hassle, a serious hassle for villagers to have that interaction with the tourists and get some money from them. Worst of all, that box, you remember? That donation box? Not everybody is there when the tourist is actually putting something in the donation box, of course. Not the whole community, even though they've said, okay, this donation box is for the whole community, but of course you will not have the whole community coming around to make sure that tourists put in or to find out what tourists put in. That is a recipe for disaster, because the villagers will say, wow, tourists put in millions in that box, but those who were there to open the box actually took a lot of that money. And this guy is building something. He must have taken that money from that box. Oh, that guy is doing that thing. Look, he now has a transport, doing this. He must have taken that money from that box. And what did that bring? A lot of jealousy, a lot of hatred, a lot of talk within the village, actually division within the village. And eventually it became so serious that the tour operators and the hotels said they're going to stop the tour because their tourists are complaining too much that this hassle must go. Otherwise, they will stop this tour. By the way, the tour is the most expensive excursion. It is every tourist going on that excursion pays something like £60 to go on the cruise boat and then go to the village. But nothing is left back in the village but, of course, a donation box. That is a recipe of disaster, causing disunity and a divided community. Now, it went to a stage when the government must come in and they decided that, well, we need to take action now. These villages, they're hassling too much because tour operators are actually complaining that they're hassling. Why should this be the case? And I was working for the Travel Foundation then, and we were called because all the tour operators were concerned. We were called that we need to solve this problem of hassle. And we did a project, a 2-year project, to look at ways and means of actually stopping the hassle. And one of the things that we started with was every tourist coming into the village must pay a gate fee. And that money goes towards the development of the village. But this village became so divided that even the money, when it was collected, they could not decide how the money was to be spent. More division. But anyway, we managed to train guides, the local guides. We managed to actually have a children's center, and we managed to do other things within the project just to ease the problem of hassle. But this did not actually stop the whole problem. Now, where am I coming from? I am actually trying to tell a story of what it means if you just get inside a community without talking to the community, without measuring the impact this will bring to the community, doing no homework, and at the end you start blaming the community for actually hassling your tourists. And at the end, you want a solution to that, but the solution you're looking for, you may or you may not agree to it. A lot of the tour operators agreed to pay the gate fee, and eventually this gate fee was paid. But as I said, the community was so divided that they could not even decide what to do with the money. I'll leave you with those thoughts. You think about it and tell me what you think. Thank you.
Adama, I suspect we're going to cut that out of the session and put it on YouTube, and it will probably trend. I wonder how many academics will make sure that their students see it. You might want to reflect on what would happen in a village in Sussex if an African tour operator started bringing people there to the village. It just wouldn't happen, would it? Abdur, Claire. I didn't quite deliberately put you straight on after Adama. It was a bit unkind of me in retrospect, but you have the last word.
Thank you very much. So Harold has asked me to talk today about the expectations on tour operators and what is appropriate for them to do in the field of human rights. But briefly, to kick off, by way of context, for those of you who don't know Abdur, Abdur is the UK's largest travel association. We have almost 1,300 members, and that's tour operators and travel agents. And that's the equivalent of over 30 billion British pounds in annual travel spend. So we have a substantial membership base, and I lead our sustainable tourism work. So that has many facets to it. It means working with those members, working with destinations that are important to those members, working with the supply chain of those members, so hotels, excursion providers, and working with holidaymakers, so engaging consumers on sustainability issues that our members in the industry is tackling and addressing, raising awareness and talking about what we're doing. And all of the initiatives are developed in partnership with the industry, so they're practical and they're targeted at mainstream tourism. And sustainable tourism covers the full breadth of the commercial and economic sustainability of the industry, the environmental issues, animal welfare, and human rights, which will be my focus for today. So why are human rights important to tour operators? We've heard already some examples. Legal compliance, I'll actually talk a little bit more about that, particularly with regards to the Modern Slavery Act, because that has some real concrete legal implications for the travel industry and human rights. Reputational risk is a real driver for tour operators looking at this. We can see some examples on the slide there of where human rights has made the headlines. But in addition, we also have the traditional benefits that you see from any kind of sustainable tourism initiative. We have, when you take human rights seriously, as you know, we heard the example from Kuoni, you can see benefits with staff engagement, with protecting your customer base, investor confidence. I've heard mainstream investors talk about how they look at human rights management as an indicator for best practice management. And also, kind of obviously, better relationships with your supply chain if you're looking at these issues across your supply chain. We've talked already about the range of human rights. We've talked as represented in various UN principles, so the International Bill of Human Rights, the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principal Rights of Work, for example, children's rights. And we've also heard examples of issues that are really important for the travel industry. So issues around work, forced labour, safety at work, issues around discrimination, issues around more vulnerable groups such as Indigenous people, minorities, children, access to land, water, even, for example, relocation of communities. All of these issues can come up within the tourism sector. And what's expected of tour operators? What is the requirement on business? And people have already mentioned some of these already. So what it all coalesces around is businesses' responsibility to respect human rights. So we've heard in 2011, business, government, civil society agreed on businesses' role in respecting human rights. That's set out in the UN Guiding Principles, also known as the Ruggie Principles, and the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework sets that out in a little bit more detail. I mentioned the Modern Slavery Act. So this act came into the UK in 2015, and it requires any business with a turnover of over 36 million British pounds that has some kind of operation in the UK, so you don't have to be based in the UK, must publish a statement on modern slavery on its homepage, accessible from its homepage. So this statement sets out in your own operations and your supply chain, your entire supply chain, how you're managing risks of modern slavery. So this is actually bringing a lot of companies to the table to think about these issues. And what we're doing is we're encouraging these companies to think about modern slavery in the context of a human rights approach. We've also heard mention of the Sustainable Development Goals, the world's to-do list now, if you like. They explicitly reference many human rights issues. And it's worth reflecting on the Global Compact, so the world's largest corporate social responsibility initiative, which mentions explicitly businesses' role in respecting human rights. So what does this all mean in practice? So in 3 simple steps, perhaps it looks deceptively simple, but first of all, we have that public commitment. So stating publicly as a business to respect human rights, referencing some of that context that I've mentioned already. And actually, for example, if you have a modern slavery statement, that will also need to be publicly available on your site. Actually, that's the kind of approach that we would recommend across human rights more generally. So setting out what you're doing and reporting progress, as Matthias has already mentioned. Identify and address your impacts. So we've heard already, identify your impacts. Map your supply chain, map your operations and your supply chain. Identify your risk areas. So this might be seasonal workers or vulnerable groups or areas that you're operating in with a weak rule of law, for example. Identify your risk areas and identify what level of due diligence is appropriate for your business. Because sometimes it can seem overwhelming, all of the things and all of the risks that you need to look at, so you do need to prioritize. And then addressing your impacts. What policies can you put in place? What can you put into your contracts with your suppliers? Can you introduce a code of conduct? And what staff training can you offer, for example? And finally, when things go wrong. And this one, actually, it needs you to know when things are going wrong. So how would people report on human rights issues? How will you find out about them? What whistleblowing policies do you have in place? But it needs to go more than that. How are you engaging with communities in a way that you will find out when things go wrong? And also on this point, act when things go wrong, it's worth reflecting that the starting point, particularly, for example, if this is an issue that's arisen from your supply chain, you work with the supplier to fix the issue rather than just walking away and stopping from working with that supplier. To finish off, I wanted to give a quick overview of some of the support that Abdur is giving its members. But the reason why I wanted to do that is it gives you a snapshot of some of the things that our members are doing. So this is all within a broader strategy on the framework that I've mentioned before. But here are some sort of concrete examples. So on modern slavery, Abdur, for all of its members, has offered guidance, setting out the requirements of the Act, what needs to be in their statement, how they can work together on these issues. And we're bringing tour operators together to learn from each other and to collaborate. We've also run training and sessions to really explore how tour operators can address modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. We've heard already about child protection, and I mean this sort of in the broader sense, including child labour issues and so on. And Abdur, we work with our members on this. We have training that can be rolled out to every single staff member. So every single staff member can be looking at potential child protection issues, and then you can have a framework on what they'll do if someone sees something that needs reporting, then what happens next. And so businesses can embed that. We haven't mentioned accessibility yet, an important human rights issue. And once again, Abdur offers guidance on accessibility as an overall issue, but also offers training that can be rolled out to all staff. I mentioned excursion providers earlier on, so we have guidance on sustainability, which incorporates how you can ensure the excursion providers you're working on are respecting human rights, and particularly flagging the sorts of issues that you might want to look for example, child protection, labour rights, labour issues, and so on. And finally, I wanted to finish up on the Travel Life certification for hotels. So this is something that's run by Abdur, but it's an international scheme available to hotels and accommodations around the world. Our members are actually starting to use this as a form of due diligence to understand their supply chain, because the Travel Life audit process covers issues such as labour rights, standards of pay, do staff have access to their own passports? And it also includes a sort of social audit approach in that the auditor will sit down and have conversations with employees, allowing a more freer form of conversation to take form and identify issues. So it's a real concrete example of how our members are looking at their supply chain and identifying risks. So that's really a brief snapshot of the expectations on tour operators and how we're working with tour operators to help them respond to that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Claire. Excuse me. We've got time for a couple of questions. I'm sorry there isn't time for more. Where is the second mic?
Yes, it is. Andy Rutherford from Fresh Eyes. Thank you all for your presentations. Fantastic. And also for the focus on the UN Guiding Principles and referencing them. The third part of the Guiding Principles is access to remedy. Yeah? And I'm really interested, the simple question is, what mechanisms have you established already for access to remedy within the industry?
There's three questions. I'm going to gather them together and then ask the panel to respond.
Thank you. My name is Nathan. I come from Sri Lanka. I live in UK. Thank you very much to take this subject, human rights. If you in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government not respect the Sri Lankan Tamil people human rights value. You know, nowadays the Sri Lankan government built a lot of hotels near the beach. That is where our fishermen, they lost their life. You know, the next time, if any country in Sri Lanka or Myanmar not respect the human rights value, not allowed here in the world travel market. This is my request. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Further question?
Hi, this is just two questions actually, one for Sama. I'm curious about the data that you presented for the child rights. I was wondering whether through your data you found some hotspots around the world, whether you found larger human rights abuses on children, just as a general curiosity. And the second question is, we're talking about how businesses should do their part on human rights, though do you think, well, this is a general question for all of you, is there anything we can do to help consumers know more about ethical travel as well? Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you to have a quick response. You don't have to answer every question, but please a kind of final comment.
Thank you. First question, access to remedy. I think this is certainly one of the still the key challenges when the two first pillars actually would come together, where the state and the actually corporates would have to collaborate. So within a company, you can set up actually internal grievance mechanisms through whistleblower compliance hotlines. This is, I guess, what the large corporates nowadays do. The challenge is actually how to make it accessible for the vulnerable group. So would a child in Vietnam pick up the phone and call us? It would not. So I think we try to work a lot through advocacy groups that can play an important role. There are the OECD contact points, obviously, for the more kind of for the bigger cases. And here certainly also the Roundtable on Human Rights and Tourism can play a very important role because it brings different actors, NGOs and private sector together. Second question, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. Actually, it's an interesting point, and also here the Roundtable has just published, I think last week, I think a very comprehensive guidance on how you should do business in post-conflict countries, and I highly recommend to everybody to have a look into this who want to do business in those in those areas of the world. It's not only in Sri Lanka, but it's also in other regions of the world. We know that the state duty is not always given, and even more important is it to take the corporate responsibility to respect the human rights.
I'll be very brief. I'll respond to the question on data, and I'll leave the rest. But particularly for our work on tourism, I mean, so UNICEF has data on sort of the child rights situation pretty much for every country in the world, and that's publicly available information. What we do on our own and with companies is sort of supplement that desk-based research with engagement with rights holders, so talking to child rights stakeholders, and we've developed a number of different tools that are, again, publicly available that support companies in that process. And it sort of refers back to the point that I was talking about before, the absolute importance of engaging with children's representatives, and where it's appropriate, children directly, to really understand how they're being impacted, and also to understand the nuances. In many cases, children, girls are impacted differently than boys, and different groups of children are impacted differently. What we do know, though, is that, tourism development generally, takes place near poor and marginalised communities, and that sort of a mix of those combination, that kind of situation already lends itself to creating vulnerabilities for children, and tourism development can exacerbate those vulnerabilities.
Is it possible to say where he can find the information? Because that was the question. Where can he get data on where the biggest hotspots are?
Specifically related to tourism?
Yes.
I can send you some links after, but for example, we've worked with Maplecroft to produce a child rights atlas, and it basically looks at child rights data across different sectors and different countries.
Thanks very much. If you let me have that, I will put it into RT News so that people can get it. If any people could be brief, I'd appreciate it.
Very, very brief. I'm going to talk about what I know, which is international volunteering from Ireland. And what we have in COLOV, which is adopted throughout the sector in Ireland, is a code of good practice. And that's based on 3 principles of what's good for the volunteer, what's good for the partner community, and what's good for the sustainability of the sending agency. And I think, one of the things that we would be saying is asking providers who are signatories to the code, what are you doing to provide that as part of your partnership? In terms then of the second question is, yes, we demand our providers to hold on to that principle that if you wouldn't build tourist products or provide tourist products or build on the beach in Doonbeg, which Donald Trump has, then you shouldn't do it in Sri Lanka either. And I think that the final part of that then is, and this was where we're going with the code in Ireland at the moment, is what I would describe as the Irish mammy being the major stakeholder, is that brand recognition that people should be able to come and say, if it's got a COLOV stamp on it, I've done the homework for you. Is that transferable to bigger national, the UK, America, Australia? I don't know, but it works in quite a small, tight market that is Ireland, and it works very well.
I'm really sorry, Adama. We've run out of time. Claire, is there anything you're desperate to say? Really briefly.
Very quickly. Just talking about when states fail to deliver on their responsibility to protect human rights. I think that's where collaboration amongst businesses is fundamental in creating progress, and that's something we're supporting businesses to do. You can't do it on your own. You have to collaborate with others.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank the panel.